And welcome to episode 11 of the Senteon and CIS webinar series, a deep dive into the CIS benchmarks for Windows workstations and servers. I'm your host, Zach Krumkowski from Senteon, typically joined by my co-host, Rich McGraw. He went sailing last week and is still going across the Atlantic with some friends. So hopefully he's back by next week, but I don't have an official ETA. But I am joined by our special guest and product board member to Senteon, Dan Lee. Super excited to have you here, Dan. And we are also joined by Senteon co-founder and CEO Henry Zhang to hop in here and share some of his knowledge as well. So thank you both for joining me on this week's episode on network access, guys.
Appreciate it, Zach. Guess we'll just be filling in for Rich today.
The most excited moderator. They call him the janitor whenever we need him to step up. But very cool. So Dan, you have a breadth of experience in the space, about 15 years in the IT security type of space. Really, I remember when we met up in person, you were telling me when you first started, what were you doing? Fixing like Xboxes or like initial laptops and so forth. Like you were really there at the beginning. So do you mind just sharing a little bit about your background, how you got into the space, and what you're doing today?
Sure. Yeah, it actually started off as a computer repair shop. So we
Computer
would
repair.
laptops, and an Xbox came in once, but it didn't fit our ideal customer profile, so we rejected an Xbox. And then eventually we realized that B2C is not very scalable and it's really hard. So we went to B2B and became an IT service provider. Then realized that having business customers call you once or twice a year is also not ideal. So we, for not just for the customer experience, but also for revenue and other factors in relationship building. So we realized that talking to customers more often and helping them out on a monthly basis made more sense. So we moved into the MSP space from there, and then realized that the MSP space is being commoditized. So how do we do better? And then all these customers have security issues. They have compliance needs. In the beginning, we worked for everyone and anyone, any industry, and realized that a lot of them don't pay well or don't have budgets for IT and cybersecurity, and realized that that's the top two or top three are enterprise B2B SaaS, the financial services space, and healthcare. So based on our team's skill sets and knowledge and the modern approach that we have with cloud and security, it fits the best with financial services and SaaS and healthcare. So we are now specialized in those companies, and that's been the journey.
That's awesome. And I mean, you really started at the very beginning when typically our partners say they're break fix MSP means there's downtime or project based, but you were there when laptops were literally broken and you had to do some manual repair on the device itself, huh?
Right. It gives a good understanding of hardware from the firmware level, and now we understand things up to a cloud architecture and a business level as well.
That's awesome.
So, yeah.
And you've really gone through that journey from transitioning to project to a SaaS model. And could you expand more about why, I guess it sounds like in your journey, you found that it was most beneficial to target a specific vertical, given financial healthcare, instead of just being this catch-all. I don't really hear that too often. We have some partners at Senteon that are focused, but a lot of them will accept clients from any industry. Could you elaborate more on that? And do you make exceptions?
We will make exceptions sometimes if there's a fit. If our customer has a network of their customers that's interesting to us. For example, we recently onboarded a social media marketing company. However, this company specializes in the healthcare space. So they only work with healthcare customers, especially large ones. So that's an interesting customer for us because in terms of network effects, that can become a referral partner.
And you got something, Henry?
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask because I was just thinking about that. One of the big things I think for financials and healthcare is that they're really highly regulated spaces. Do you treat somebody like that social media marketing company the same as you do a financial or healthcare firm? Obviously, they probably have some HIPAA-related requirements, but I can't imagine it's as stringent as an actual healthcare provider.
It's not as stringent. However, our customers asks that customer specifically for to have better security controls, as they have lots of access to private information or data or confidential information. So those larger enterprise customers would look to that customer for that type of security. So just like in the SaaS space, if you're a SaaS company selling to the enterprise security team would look at your SBOM, look at your configurations and your policies and things like that. So it's the same for this social media company. Their customers are asking them for a higher level of assurance and trust.
That makes a lot of sense why the exception was made. I guess going into a little bit more about, sorry, I'm interested by this choosing a vertical and kind of rolling with it. Did this allow you to scale better? Do conversations differ across verticals? Like, I guess what was the real driving force to try to specialize?
I think the driving force and is the conversation. So one is the understanding of the client of what we offer, and they also understand better why they need us, and they also understand that this initiative or this goal or this requirement is larger than something that they can do themselves, and it doesn't make sense to try to build a team in-house, and it makes more sense to partner with specialized firms that can help with these types of needs. And in a holistic sense, because we're specialized in financial services and healthcare and compliance and SaaS, the types of people we hire have that experience already. Versus if I took any kind of business, then we can hire more generalized IT staff for our company. Whereas since we're specialized in these three verticals, then we need the people that have that experience, and then our training and ongoing education also and certifications also aligns with what our customers need. So we make sure that our staff gets trained in, it becomes like AWS solutions architects. They get certified in AZ 900, things like that. So based on our customer needs, we will train our staff to meet those needs,
That's
which
cool.
means
So
we're continuously investing in certain things.
yeah, that's really cool because you're not just doing it from a marketing or a branding standpoint. I mean, you're living and breathing this. You're reinvesting to make sure you all have the best team, the right, I guess, overall model to service the market. It's not just, hey, this is my marketing, this is my branding material. You guys do it all the way through the house.
Right. Yeah, it goes from sales, marketing to service delivery and client success, and then your engineering talent and tooling as well. So sometimes the tools we have to upgrade them or change them as if they don't have CIS hardening or benchmarking built into the MDM tool or the RMM tool, then we have to build it or we have to go buy it. So basically that's part of the control or part of our needs is to have those types of features built into our stack across the board.
Very cool. So before we get into today's topic with network access, which we do have about a dozen configurations to cover, so we'll spend only a couple minutes on each slide. But before we do that, I do want to hear about Black Hat. So you just got back from your trip, still kind of gathering your thoughts, but anything to share about the event this year? How was it? Any highlights?
Yeah, Black Hat was really good for us, and it was really busy. So I felt like definitely we're recovered from COVID in terms of conferences, at least. I also went to DEF CON, and walking around DEF CON, there seemed to be a lot more actual hackers this year. There were lots of people with antennas hanging out of their backpacks, or people literally holding antennas this large and walking around, very obviously stealing data off of the air at DEF CON. So I think it really relates to the topic at hand today, and it just shows that people like that are out there, and we can get more into it. I also bought a Faraday laptop case for my laptop and my phone.
Nice.
So if anyone doesn't know what that is, if you put your phone inside a Faraday case, it basically blocks GPS signal, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, cell signal two-way. So it's a black box. It kills all signals. So nobody can, your phone can't talk to the outside world, which means nobody can steal your data.
That's awesome. As good as unplugging the machine.
Hopefully.
So that's awesome to hear. And it sounds like obviously from the product side, you found some stuff interesting. Just out of curiosity for the people who haven't been to Black Hat or DEF CON, especially speaking to our managed security service provider audience, Did you discover any new vendors or new priorities that you want to explore at your MSP because of going to this show?
Yeah, we talked to a pretty interesting automation company that was leveraging generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave you an Omni box where you can put inside the box, I want this workflow. For example, if any devices are not using Senteon, then block them from the network using Intune, something like that. You can just type it in, and then it would build the workflow for you. So you wouldn't even have to drag lines and boxes and write APIs. It would give you the template and try to fill out as much as it can by itself, based on its training on workflows, which was pretty cool. So I think um, AI and automation tools are what we're interested in
Yep.
mostly, and that's who I talk to a lot at Black Hat.
I think automation has been trending for a few years, and the tie-in to AI is just prioritizing it even more. But very cool. Awesome to hear those highlights. Let's dive a little bit into today's topic of network access. Do you mind just kind of sharing at a high level what does network access mean? Why is configuring it securely important to your security posture? And I guess what's the business goal of having a strongly configured network access?
So, well, computers are, they can work on their own, but they work better in a network, which allows you to share data. And, you know, in a network, you need to talk to the server, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. There's data being transferred, and so you want to make sure that your data is being transferred in a authenticated and a secure way,
Mm-hmm.
and not generally allow anonymous network connectivity, anonymous access, as then you don't know if that actor is real or malicious, basically. So
Yep, we'll be getting into a lot of those anonymous configurations today, which I mean, hearing about how important that is, which we'll dive into the security risk of that. But the fact a lot of these settings we're talking about today are left in a non-configured state or a default unsecure state is going to be interesting as we dive through here. Henry, did you want to add more on this network access topic?
I mean, I think specifically in the context that we'll be looking at today, it is a lot of just sort of cover your ass on legacy systems, a lot of stuff that was set up maybe not too well when they were first architecting this out. And these days it's just sort of like you should never really have this set up or enabled. But it exists, so we're here to take a look.
It does exist, and thankfully CIS creates the recommendations.
Oh, actually, just on the DEF CON Black Hat note,
Mm-hmm.
all of our phones, whether they're iPhones or Android phones, certain phones, when you disable the Bluetooth or Wi-Fi connectivity or network access or network connectivity, it actually just doesn't really truly turn off. It still has a background connectivity that's still on. So in terms of network access, from our phones, we can't really configure settings to that level because those settings are delegated to Apple or to Android or whatever manufacturer you have on the Android side. So that's where having layers of security is important, such as a Faraday case, because even though you disable Bluetooth, that connectivity is still there in the background because for usability, they want the ability for other devices to contact it for certain reasons like AirDrop, where or Wi-Fi password sharing, and that has background features. So even though you turn things off, it doesn't really turn off until you go to true like airplane mode.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, turns off all communications, but if you leave it on and only tap the button to turn it off, it's still on in the background, which means anonymous network actors like somebody with a huge antenna in their backpack still.
No one was walking around with huge antennas, were they? That's sarcasm. No.
No, they actually were. I saw like three of them, but those people can actually scrape your Bluetooth ID and your Mac ID, and then once they have that, they can actually follow you around and figure out where you live and things like that. Eventually, there's a YouTube video online where someone was on the top of the Hollywood sign, and they had an antenna. They pointed it at downtown LA, and they were able to pinpoint someone's nearly exact location based on their Bluetooth ID and their Wi-Fi ID, and triangulate their location. So that's anonymous network access for you in a nutshell.
Love a good old doxing.
Yeah.
Well, I think that transitions perfectly into our first slide. So that story aligns perfectly with a lot of these MITRE attack tactics that we're talking about. And Cliff, that is we got a few on the slide. If you mind talking about a few of these, just kind of talk about I guess how having a poorly configured network access may allow some of these MITRE attack tactics to I guess be more prone to success. Kind of talk about how they'll take advantage of this.
All right, so on this slide it says execution, persistence, defense evasion, credential access, lateral movement. Basically, when you have anonymous actors on your network, they can try to execute malicious code or deploy a keylogger to capture your keystrokes on your computer. Persistence means that they're going to just live inside your environment and persist there until you find them. So if you don't have controls in place that can throw an alert or create an alert for you to even know that somebody is in your network, then they will persist there for months or years sometimes. And there are real life stories of this happening all the time, and you can find that online. Defense evasion, that's where a malicious actor will delete the breadcrumbs or delete the traces of their own activity while they're working inside your environment. It makes it harder for you to find them. So when you're running network scanning tools and things like that, it will make it hard to find.
Thanks.
I think the slide is great. I think the other thing that was on there was lateral movement, which I wasn't quite sure if you talked about that one, Dan, but lateral movements is always my favorite one. Just sort of the idea of being able to utilize the network technically for what it's made for, to move around between systems and systems, just maybe not in the way that that our great IT administrators intended.
Yeah, right. So let's say somebody clicks a bad link in email, and then they get an automatic execution of a code. The code persists. They delete their data, they hide there, and then in the meantime, they move laterally from one computer to another computer, to a server, to more computers, or even from a network device like an IoT device, like a printer, a DNA sequencer in the healthcare space. They can take that device over, jump over to your computer, scrape your credentials and passwords off of your Chrome browser or Edge browser, and then take those credentials and then use like discovery tools to pretend to be a domain admin. Then they have full control of the whole network. Now they have everyone's passwords. They'll wait and persist for a few more months and then plan their attack. And then one day they launch a ransomware and take over your whole network and encrypt all your data.
Yep. And we're going to be talking about some of that credential access through SAM accounts in some of these configuration settings. So yeah, that's a good overview of this, and let's start to dive a little bit deeper. So as a reminder, everyone, we are talking about the CIS benchmarks to secure your Windows workstations and servers today. So the goal here is to give a high level of all of the settings under network access, and hopefully Dan has some kind of user stories, potentially disruptive stories that have happened to him, and really get into that. So feel free to toss questions. We will have a Q&A at the end of this. And as a reminder, Senteon does have these descriptions available within our web app, and we are going to be posting these slides to YouTube after and putting together a little bit of a resource hub. So more about that on next week's episode once it's live. So let's get into some of these slides here. The first one is going to be ensuring network access allow anonymous SID name translations is set to disabled. So again, just want to emphasize here with the GPO name, allow anonymous and disabled. Make sure you always read through these GPOs, because you see the word anonymous and you want to make sure it's blocked. It's a lot of double negatives in here. So, but Dan, do you mind just kind of explaining what an SID name translation is and why anonymous access would be less than ideal here?
So an SID is a security identifier for an identity, whether that's a user or a computer in a Windows network environment. And basically, the reason why you'd want that to not be anonymous is back to the malicious actor. You want to know, or back to Control 1 in CIS, it's know your assets, and you want to know about all of your hardware assets, network assets, users in your environment, applications. So in the AD environment, these SIDs are assigned to those assets, so that way they're known SIDs. And once you have an inventory of known SIDs, then you can allow list activities for certain SIDs and then block the rest. And obviously, you don't want anonymous activity in your network, because then it's hard to track that in terms of logging, and you can't configure rules to block and allow if you don't know who they are.
Mm-hmm. And is this something that needs to be reviewed on like a weekly basis, quarterly, or once you kind of set up these allowed lists, how often are you actually reviewing it?
So I think allow list should be reviewed at least quarterly,
Mm-hmm.
and even then, that's 3 months or 90 days worth of activity, and a lot can happen even in one day in a business, especially a fast-paced growing business. So these types of things should be done on a continuous basis.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in terms of zero trust, you want to, by default, deny all activity unless it's explicitly allowed, if that's realistic or possible in your network.
Mm-hmm.
And by setting up a deny all policy, then you can see everything that's being denied, which means you can then review that list of denied and see what you should be allowing for business to happen. Um, with that approach, you'll have much more high security. With
Mm-hmm.
the typical approach of allowing everything and then going through even more logs and more activity and more SIDs, then trying to pare that down, it's a lot harder of an approach. So I think
Absolutely.
this makes
So
total sense to turn that off.
yeah, something that comes to mind for me too, Dan. I know you guys at Red Cup put a lot of focus on identity management and ensuring that things are properly configured in that sense. Have you dealt with any sort of situations where you had somebody or a client that wanted to ensure they had anonymous access, whether because they were lazy or because they had a specific process in place, so they were like, yeah, we need to be able to enumerate SIDs anonymously?
We haven't come across that in the past,
Okay.
and so I can't really speak to that.
Mm-hmm.
I think typically our clients trust us to do the right thing and have more security versus less security, which is why we go after the verticals that we do. In the past, we've had construction companies or law firms that have pushed back a lot in terms of, hey, we don't know what this control does. Is we don't have the time to learn from you, and we're not interested.
Yeah.
So those types of customers, don't give you the time of day or don't care, and it's not the best experience. And then something can happen to them, and then there can be finger pointing and blame. So for us, we're targeting customers that don't just want like HIPAA compliance or SOC 2
Mm-hmm.
compliance. They want that to be a baseline, and they want to go further, which is where you go towards CIS, which is more granular and well-defined controls versus a self-attestation that's much more open to interpretation.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That it sounds like in the relationship that you have with your partners is, you're making they're not just recommendations, it's things they already want to do and they want to overachieve. So you don't necessarily have to deep dive into this. So very cool how specializing in this market has given you that, I guess, respect and trust between you and partners pretty early out of the gate, it sounds like. So very cool. Thanks for sharing that, Dan.
You're
All right,
welcome.
let's dive into the next setting here. More anonymous access. So do not allow anonymous enumeration of SAM accounts, set to enabled. So do not enabled, making sure we don't have it. So this is your security account manager. Could you explain a little bit about what this is and how this can guard against information leakage?
So basically, in malicious actors can pretend to be or take over SAM accounts, and then from there they can enumerate your AD, meaning they can figure out who are all of your users and what are the folders, what are the computers and networks they're allowed to talk to from there, and they can then map out your whole environment and they get a good lay of the land, and then
Mm-hmm.
from there they can plan how to navigate laterally through your network and which users, for example, have weak passwords that they can target, which users have lots of access, like an admin, a global admin, or a domain admin, enterprise admin, or maybe it's just the CEO or a C-level person of the company or the CFO who can send wire transfers. So your directory has a lot of information about your users and your network, and
Mm-hmm.
these malicious actors are typically in other countries, or this is all over the network, right? So they don't really see you, they don't go to your office, they don't know who you are, but based on these types of pieces of data that they can gather as a SAM actor, they can
Mm-hmm.
learn a lot about your company and learn patterns and figure out how to attack you and how to take advantage of your environment.
I,
And
I
so,
really I really like that you mentioned kind of lay of the land, because this is almost in this scenario and the example you presented, it's almost just information gathering, right? They're understanding what accounts are there, what access privileges they may have, and ultimately their target, right? Could you expand a little bit more for our audience that hasn't heard the term lay of the land?
yeah. So usually when you get just if you're already in the IT space or MSP space, then you're aware that whenever you get a new client and onboard them, you also need a lay of the land as well. You need to learn the environment in order to manage it well or operate it in a good way or help secure and protect it. So
Mm-hmm.
we're looking for vulnerabilities, we're looking for low-hanging fruit. What are some changes we can make to improve the environment? However, if you're a bad guy, then you're thinking, okay, what are the low-hanging fruit? What doors are open already? Where are the credentials weak? Where are the permissions overly privileged? What accounts can I attack? What accounts can I leverage? And in terms of lay of the land, it's like the fog of war. So
Mm-hmm.
you want to see and know as much as you can about your adversary, so that way you can best attack them and be the most effective.
Yep, spot on. Let's go over to this next setting. Like I said, we do have a dozen to go through, so we'll power through this a little fast today. But another do not allow anonymous enumeration of SAM accounts and shares. So you're going to want this set to enabled, because you do not allow. But could you talk to us a little bit about this, the enumeration, how that can be used, and why you'd want to have this locked down as well?
Yeah, I believe I already addressed the SAM
Yeah.
accounts, and then we can talk about shares. So network shares, that could be your HR data, your financials data. Network shares could also be your share drives that you're using to manage your Windows network. So, for example, when you deploy a new computer, deploy a new server, or you have a WSUS Windows Update server, or repository of applications you're deploying to your environment, bad actors can enumerate those folders and then figure out, oh, they have a repo where they're pulling from for all the applications. So let me just go ahead and insert some malicious apps into that share. Now, whenever a new laptop gets onboarded, it's going to grab all the applications from this folder, including the malicious applications as well. So that's
Yep.
one way somebody can abuse that. Um, and then in terms of financial data or healthcare data, those PIIs, they can steal it and sell it online. And if you don't have a monitoring tool to figure out that, you won't know until it's too late, meaning it's been posted on Pastebin or it's already been sold, or a news article gets written about you.
Yep. Unfortunately, just having that data and selling it is, you don't have to just, it's not just about the ransomware or malware creating that disruption. Just getting the data and getting out undetected, just as valuable from that attacker point of view.
Yep.
Yep. All right. Henry, I know you got some construction in the background. Is there anything more you wanted to add on SAM accounts before we keep moving on?
I'm having a great time over here. No, I think Dan summarizes that up sort of really, really concisely here, right? The only thing I think that comes to mind for me is I always like to think about why these things exist, like I said, and I think it's probably the only thing I would add on to that is when we're thinking about sort of, why do we allow anonymous enumeration for SAM accounts and shares? Why do we allow anonymous access, even for the previous ones, the SIDs and things like that? And it is just sort of understanding these use cases. And a lot of these situations, it's just for like Windows NT domains and like Windows version 3 or things like that, where they're so old that at this point, you really need to be reassessing if you're still running them. But it is, I think, good to sometimes take a step back and understand why that's necessary, why that's happening, and maybe why that use case might be appropriate. In this case, I have a pretty hard time justifying it, but I think it's worth pointing out at least.
Absolutely. As there are updates and changes, these settings are available. But if you don't need them, make sure you lock them down. So that's the big thing we want to address. All of these settings we talk about every week is proactive security measures that most of the time are not enabled by default. So definitely take the time to go through these and do as much as you can. All right, let's switch gears a little bit in this next topic. So every week, I swear we have something about password and credentials. There's so many ways to get to these in network. So do not allow storage of passwords and credentials for network authentication. Set to enabled. So obviously we have to store our credentials and passwords somewhere, but could you talk about why this network access setting is important here?
So just like before, if you have passwords in the network and someone's in your network, that means they can enumerate and crawl your network. And maybe that share that you allowed via the SAM anonymous discovery earlier has your passwords, your network passwords, or your Windows authentication credential manager has passwords in there. They can enumerate that, download it, and then potentially try to decrypt it. Or sometimes these passwords are just not even encrypted at all because, like Henry mentioned, a lot of a lot of these mechanisms were designed years ago where security was not a concern, or security was not it just wasn't part of the design. So it was designed to just be to do what it needed to do. And in terms of the context, these types of environments and settings were typically in on-prem Windows, and the computers were all local, the servers were all local. Then you would have a corporate firewall that would protect everything, envelop everything. So then, because it's inside behind a firewall, you would just assume that, okay, if nobody can break in, it's secure. And yes, it is secure until somebody breaks in. And now, in 1999, there may be 10 ways to break in. Now in 2023, there's 1,000 ways to break in, or 10,000 ways to break in. So
it's like you could put an X to that number every couple of years, or maybe every year.
If you look at modern attack, there are just hundreds of different methods or tactics, techniques, and things that they can do. So it's a different world that we live in now. So having passwords in the network or in a folder or an Excel sheet used to be fine, and most likely nobody would do anything with it. But now there are so many automated tools where you can just run a scan. It'll find all the passwords and show you or show the attacker exactly where it is. So that's why we definitely not allow.
And I like how you kind of shared, the landscape is changing. Maybe decades ago there was only 10 ways to get into a machine, and now there are thousands and thousands. I guess switching a little bit back to your MSP model, Dan, how has your security stack changed over time? Have you been able to condense it down to a few solutions? I might have some inside knowledge to know that's not the case, but have you expanded that? And could you kind of talk to the MSP audience about, I guess, why you probably have expanded and what your process is to determining, which new solutions, identify the needs. Talk a little bit more about your at-home security choices.
Yeah, so I think our MSP stack and our security stack has expanded a lot over time to address automation needs and security needs as well, because the more tools we have, the more overhead we have to manage everything, which means we need more automation for all of these tools and of these processes. And moving from no security to some security to CIS benchmarks, where they're asking you to have settings configured for hundreds of configurations, then how do you even begin to manage that on a continuous basis for one environment? And as an MSP, we have 10, 20, 100, some MSPs have thousands of environments that they manage. So how do you expect to, have network access, do not allow storage of passwords, with one control across 1,000 clients with 10 servers each? That's 10,000 servers. Like, how do you plan to do that with Intune, or how do you plan to do that with ADMX or GPO, which is the traditional way of managing it? It's really not scalable. And how do you manage drift of these configurations? So maybe it's a Windows update, and Microsoft loves to change your settings whenever you update. So that's one factor. Another factor is there's so many admins. Maybe you're co-managing an environment, or you hire two engineers and they have different levels of experience training. So somebody may come in after and undo what you did. Or maybe you have a malicious actor in your environment that's changing things and they've been persisting there for months and you didn't
Yep.
know. So, you turn on a setting with GPO or registry key edits and then they turn it off. And how long until you figure out that it's been turned off? Is it minutes, hours, days, months, years? So that we need more tools, if anything, and we need more integrations of tools, and we need our MSP stack to be API native and friendly, meaning our
Yep.
tools should not live in a silo. They should live in an ecosystem or a platform of other tools where they can all communicate.
Yep. I love that overview, and I think you're right on trend with what I'm hearing from our partners and the conversations I have. It's all about having the right security stack and making sure that they do work together and communicate together so that you can better triage issues, feed into each other. So right on pace with what I'm also seeing in the market on that. Henry, did you want to expand at all on that before we go to the next slide?
Hard to expand on that. I think Dan covered mostly
covered it.
I think about that. Yeah.
So Black Hat and DEF CON, to go back to that, I think I've had some conversations, and Senteon actually came up a few times in terms of OS hardening, and we mentioned that we're starting to write scripts in our RMM tools and our device trust tools to look for Senteon. So if your Windows computer is not running Senteon, then I know for a fact that the CIS benchmarks I'm pushing and managing through Senteon are not being applied because the agent doesn't exist there. So that's how we're leveraging one tool to make sure that another tool is being used continuously. So there's checks and balances.
Try to get that holistic approach, basically, right?
Yeah.
Yep. All right, let's get into some of these more settings. A lot more about this anonymous access. So let everyone permissions apply to anonymous users. I think just reading that GPO out loud sounds a bit terrifying that you want an anonymous user to have everyone permissions. So talk to us a little bit about what an everyone permission is and point out the obvious of why an anonymous user having that could be dangerous.
So in terms of network access, typically that's access to a device, a computer, or a folder, and you don't want everyone to have access to everything. That's like having a house with no windows and no doors. Anyone can just come in and out whenever they
Or
want.
animals or anything for that matter.
Exactly. Or non-humans. So, basically, you want to know who's in your network and who's allowed to do what. So if you're the CFO, you should have access to the finance files. If you're the working in the warehouse, you should have the warehouse network or VLAN, and you should have the warehouse folder, but not the financial folder, and vice versa. So if you allow everyone on the finance folder, everyone's going to get in. If you allow everyone on your server, everyone's going to get in. If you allow everyone on your sysvol on your server, everyone's going to get into that too, and then they can do whatever they want. And in terms of logging, it'll be very noisy because instead of one user modifying files in that folder, now you have 1,000 or hundreds. So you're going to be combing through logs, filtering through logs for a lot of data. So if there's an attack or something like that, it'll take you much longer to figure out what's going on.
Yep, and I think to expand on that even a little further, one of these things that I always try to talk towards the CIS and the CIS benchmarks is we're helping increase that operational efficiency. We're making sure people can't get to areas they have no place being. I mean, law of least privilege, but it's making sure if something does happen, it doesn't take forever to comb through these logs. Make sure that it's already pinpointed before you even have to do too much work. So that's a great example on that one. Let's keep on moving through. So we got network access, named pipes that can be accessed anonymously. I see this one actually pretty often when we do set up Senteon, because part of our features is that we call out pre-configured settings. So this one has been changed quite a few times. It can be set up by various software being installed that may need access. So I've definitely seen in the MSP market use cases for this. But in a perfect world, workstations are going to have this set to none, and then servers will have this configured to a specific either group or access. But talk to us a little bit about what this means, Dan.
Well, by enforcing this, it means that you're actually able to manage the network, and that's what our clients pay us to do, is to manage networks, not to not manage them or leave them in an unmanaged state. So in terms of configuration, we should be looking at every single configuration and managing them all. And if you don't know what name pipes are, and then you should maybe rely on a service partner or rely on an expert for that. So
Mhm.
whether that's hiring the right engineer or learning that yourself or using a SaaS tool to help solve this problem for you, that's something that you should look into.
It's
And
a very politically correct answer for that one.
and
Um,
yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead, finish your thought.
Yeah, that's just gonna say, again, with the name pipes, why would you, unless there's a business use case to allow that activity, then you don't need to. Maybe like Zach said, there is a client server application or something like that in your network. Maybe you're working for an engineering firm, they have a CNC machine, or you're working for a medical device company and they have medical devices that are IoT and they have traditional on-prem networks and they need this type of activity, then just scope it down to the devices that needs this feature, and then allow anonymous for just those devices that need that, and then disallow everything else. So if you need to allow anonymous activity, then scope it down and control it, and then monitor it as well. So you should have controls.
I think the interesting thing about what you said too is a lot of times when it comes to tools like this, or I guess settings like this with name pipes and anonymous access, it's sort of a catch-22 where you do want to get a tool that help you manage and look through it. But a lot of the times, these sort of vulnerabilities that will abuse this most often come from SaaS tools that haven't been vetted very well. A lot of times, Zach said, we do see these in onboardings. Just because there's a lot of tools that still use sort of older, archaic techniques to ensure that they always work. And it is that accessibility versus security sort of mindset, I guess, that we still struggle with on occasion. So you definitely want to look for something to help you look for anonymous access for things like name pipes, but you also don't want to be installing the tools that are actually creating the that are actually setting up name pipes for anonymous access, whether it's for convenience or laziness or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I would highly encourage MSPs to have lab environments. So if you don't already have a lab environment or a digital twin of your customer's environment or your own environment, then that's the best way is to try to recreate this in a lab environment, turn it off and see what breaks. Otherwise, how can you really, you don't want to figure out that something's broken in production, because then your customers will be unhappy or you'll cause them to lose revenue, lose time. So definitely create a lab environment and test these CIS controls and different settings in a lab environment before you push it live.
Yep, I always encourage our partners to look at their evaluation findings within Senteon for those disruption factors. But there have been scenarios where the MSP just goes, "I want to see what breaks." That is the traditional mindset, and sometimes it can be easier. If you do have that breadth of knowledge on all GPOs, and you're like, "Oh, this isn't working," they may know the exact change to make, and it would have taken more time to review the evaluation data. So to each their own on that. But to Dan's point, being able to do this testing, having some type of standardized rollout process, whether it's in a testing environment that's a replica, or maybe they have some test machines that they allow you to use, setting this up for best practices is very important, because these options can be disruptive, right? We're changing the way the OS interacts with that end user. Very, very powerful things. So all right, that end rant there. So let's get into this next one. Network access again. So remotely accessible registry paths. Just setting this to configured, because by default this is just not configured. So making sure this actually has a dedicated path. Talk to us why this would be important.
So registry paths can tell a malicious actor of what kind of registry keys or settings do you even have in the environment. So it again advises them of what's configured in your environment. So you don't want someone to remotely access your registry paths, because then they'll figure out what you have on that server, that computer, and then how can they take advantage of that situation. So by default, you should configure the settings. So
Mm-hmm.
usually these in Windows, if you don't configure something, it's usually by default allow.
Yep.
And that's it makes Microsoft really easy to use, but also very easy to abuse as well. So it's important to have the setting configured. So yeah, it's important to pay attention to these little details that Microsoft engineers and software developers have put in place for you over time. And every single setting matters in Windows because it only takes one setting for a malicious actor to abuse it, right? So whether it's this one or the previous 8, um,
However far we are today.
I don't know how far we are, but yeah, you only need one thing that's configured. And registry paths are really important because that's how you control BitLocker enforcement, for example, or a 15-minute security policy. So if you're not monitoring that, then somebody can enumerate that path and then figure out, okay, how can I go and change the setting from a 15-minute lockout to a 1-hour lockout? So now I can send someone into your office, or I can send somebody remotely onto that computer that's not locked yet because I've changed it from 15 minutes to 4 hours, to 3 days. So that computer stays on for 3 days, which gives me time to go in the computer, go out of the computer, go back into it again, run different things, and it's not going to go to sleep. So there's lots of different things that an attacker can do with this control.
Absolutely.
So,
And Henry, I know you have some extra thoughts on that. And,
yeah, I was
and
going to say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to tie in the next setting as well, if we don't mind showing that slide. But it's something very similar, talking about having the successful registry paths and subpaths also to configured. So, Henry, I figured you can give a response talking about both these slides because I feel like they relate.
Yeah, I think the thing that's interesting, if you actually look at the CIS recommendations for these, and we talk a lot about locking down access as much as possible, but it's actually a pretty extensive list of paths, both paths and subpaths, that CIS will recommend are or should be accessible for the full remote access. And it's sort of one of those things where at face value, you're not really sure why you would need remote registry access to, things like the system or to software keys and things like that. But if we do a little digging into that, what I always thought was interesting about these sort of settings is that they're actually required for a lot of Microsoft specific use cases. So if you're using things like the baseline security analyzer for Microsoft, or systems management server, or even for remote access, it does actually require some of these registries to be remotely accessible. And so these get sort of an additional layer of complexity because you also have to understand what is important to allow remote access for and what isn't, right? Because like Dan said, you expose too much, you create a bunch of backdoors, create a bunch of holes in your security there, and all the other settings become rendered irrelevant. But then if you just go through and just remove every registry path, you get a big lock on some of the functionality that maybe you were expecting to have, whether that is remote access to the system or running a baseline analyzer or something along those lines.
Yep, absolutely. So we got about 4 more settings with 10 minutes left. So Dan, we'll do a little bit of a speed round, a couple minutes per setting. Going into this, we got network access, restrict anonymous access to named pipes and shares. So this can be, a very sensitive communication channel. So making sure, again, going towards what Henry's talked about, what you've talked about, Dan, it's making sure you have those right access set up. Is there anything more you want to add to this? I know I don't want it to get too repetitive, but do you have additional thoughts on this one?
I think it just goes back to logging. So while anonymous access, you should know everything that's going on your network. And if you don't, then turn this on and you'll find out what breaks, and then you'll find out who's there. So
these settings always give me a little bit of a laugh because it does feel like Microsoft went through and they were like, we're gonna secure harden these things, and then they went back and looked at what they did and they were like, maybe it's not enough. And so they set up another setting to do basically the same thing. Just in case the first one didn't catch everything. Gotta be sure.
Yeah, and I think with these settings too, sometimes you can clone the registry key and scope it to different areas as well. When you actually look at the registry, you can there's more than is shown on this slide here.
Yep.
So it does make sense that this is so repetitive because there are those edge cases where you do need this anonymous setting to be on, but again, just scope it to the part of your environment that needs it.
Yeah, what we're mentioning there is just kind of that registry path, because that's definitely not tossed onto the slides just for too much content. But understanding which setting is relating to which area within that OS. So spot on to call that out. All right, so the next slide here, restrict clients allowed to make remote calls to SAM. So this one also seems a little obvious, but go ahead and talk about why only admins should probably have access to this remotely and remote access.
Right. So if you allow anonymous users or any user to make remote calls to SAM, that means they can view it, they can make potential changes to your environment. And why would you want, having too many chefs in the kitchen is already a problem, or too many hands in the pot. But then having untrained hands in the pot would be even worse. So I'm sure everyone that has experienced, someone on your team or a client accidentally deleting a file or moving folders into the wrong folder, then they call you, wondering why things have disappeared or been deleted by accident. Someone just like presses the wrong keystroke. So same thing. If you allow end users to have admin access to your environment, then unintended things can happen. And so limiting that, it's a no-brainer.
Yep. Absolutely. It's crazy. CIS has so many of these topics, and our first, I think weeks 3 and 4 went over the user rights assignments. And, even if it's not in that section, all of these, again, just emphasize every week. It's all preventative, proactive steps to harden your environment, make it less accessible to the bad guys, keep your users where they need to be, and so forth. Henry, you looked like you had a little bit more to add to that comment. Did you have something?
No, I was just laughing because, technically, if you're restricting access to the SAM to only administrators, then you're also blocking anonymous access. But, as always, the redundancy factor here, you got to make sure anonymous users are blocked twice.
Yep.
It's just once wasn't enough.
Oh, every time. So, all right, we got two more settings to go over. So we got shares that can be accessed anonymously. Again, don't want to beat the dead horse. Very, very similar type of thing. But yes, you're going to want this set to none in this case, recommended by CIS. So in this scenario, I mean, who's going to have access? Why isn't access needed? Maybe Dan.
I think definitely we've already talked about this multiple times at this point, and so only allow known users and admins to access your share. If we don't know who you are, you don't have access. It's just least privilege. And so this is just like a control for that, and I feel like it makes sense.
Absolutely.
And
all right,
CIS, it's a collaboration of many different experts. So when you read the papers, you read the benchmarks, you'll see lots of names there for just one control. So there have been committees and people that have debated all these settings that we're going over here on a high level. So if anyone wants to learn more, I would highly recommend to actually go down the benchmark and read the explanation about why and all the different cases about why this should be set to none. And they'll really go into on a deep level. But I think sticking to these benchmarks and then seeing if it affects your business or not. If it doesn't affect anything, then leave it.
Yep. Very good. So last setting on the day. So another sharing and security model for local accounts. Having this set to classic. Local users authenticate as themselves. Kind of saying, I like the logo that we put here. It looks like the verification. But Dan, explain to us why we want to make sure those local users are able to be authenticated and prove to be themselves.
So in this model, certain users sometimes can be allowed to assume another identity. So basically, by turning this control on, if Henry's doing something or Zach or Dan is doing something, then it's definitely Dan or it's definitely Zach. So in terms of logging or discovery post breach, then you'll know, or post just incident, you'll know it was Dan that messed things up and not like Dan pretending to be Zach or vice versa. So
masquerading.
Exactly, masquerading or impersonation. So those are things that are typical, and there are business use cases where maybe I do need to pretend to be Zach in the network to do something like install an application or modify a file. But by turning this control on, then it makes sure that I'm using my own identity and not somebody else's identity, whether that's a human or a service account.
Yep. Henry, that's the last setting on today's topic. Anything to add on anything we went over this current setting we're on?
No, I just think, well, yeah, actually, talking to this setting, it's definitely one of the ones that I find to be sort of the strangest in their sort of list of recommendations, especially because the other available option is to allow local users to authenticate as guests. And that's one of their, what do you call it, their default recommendation for this configuration. And it's sort of a testament, I think, with all of these settings and the redundancies here and the anonymous access, that Windows really is sort of built from an accessibility perspective, where everything is designed and set up to allow as much access as possible, so that you can do what needs to get done. And it really is one of those things where the onus is on us to ensure that we're locking those things down, whether we need to do it once, twice, or 3 times to make Microsoft happy. Just make sure that we are doing it.
I think that's a great overview. So spot on. All right, Dan, we did a lot of Q&A kind of throughout this back and forth, but I do have just a few questions to show right here to ask. We definitely handled those first two pretty in depth. If you can focus on that slide, but I want to ask, if you do need to create an exception, how do you manage that? What are there additional precaution steps you need to take if you are allowing some anonymous access, because you have to have this application to work? Could you, I guess, just talk to us a little bit about exceptions, how you deal with them at your MSP, and if there are extra steps you need to take when an exception is in place?
Sure. So in terms of change management, if there's an exception, we discuss it with our customer. We make sure that there's someone on our team that's a senior engineer that will sign off on that exception, and then we go to the customer to also get approval from them as well. Then we document it in the ticket, and then in addition to the ticket in our documentation system, whether it's I guess I shouldn't mention names, but in your documentation system, you should write out the exception and what device or what server or what network it's being configured for. So you don't have to go dig in your tickets and find these exceptions. You should have an exceptions document or a configuration document that shows the as-built configuration with the exceptions. So that way, any engineer or your customers can then go and audit and review this over time as things change. So as your network modernizes and maybe your client server application moves to the cloud, you no longer need this in your on-prem AD, then you can review these settings over time without needing to log into the server or needing to go and dig through thousands of tickets to find this one setting that you made 3 years ago. So having a separate document helps us a lot with being able to keep that data searchable and discoverable.
And I liked how you talked about like that approval and signing off process. I mean, that paper trail, it sounds like that's pretty valuable in your point of view.
It is, and it's one of the requirements too of many of the compliance frameworks is to have change management, which means you have a change approval board. If you look inside the PSA tools, such as Halo, Autotask, or ConnectWise, typically there is even a CAB section of that PSA tool. And if you've never seen that or never looked for it, you should definitely go look for it and try to turn that on. See how does that actually change your workflow for your PSA, which means it's changing the workflow of your team. And more checks and balances are a good thing. So going from an unmanaged state to a state where now we have these new 14 controls that we discussed today in place. How are you approving that? How are you reviewing that over time? And how is that changing over time?
It's awesome to hear. Very, very awesome, guys. And that we're right at the hour mark. Before I do my wrap up comments, are there any final thoughts from either of you guys? I'll ask Henry first since you just wrapped up. Dan, is there any final thoughts from you, Henry?
You always put me on the spot with these things.
We can go back to Dan. He's had time to prep at this point.
No. No, I think it's always interesting to sort of go through these, whether I'm sitting in front of the camera or listening to behind the camera, right? and just sort of see how the structure of the operating system is configured, how these settings sort of work in, and how that is sort of reflected in like the things Dan was talking about, right? Even with other tools, with auto tasks, with PSAs, with other identity access and management tools, it is just sort of interesting to see that these structures all interconnect in ways that maybe you wouldn't expect. And just trying to get to the bottom of understanding how they work together, so that we're not breaking a bunch of shit in production. The end goal there.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And
Go ahead, Dan.
oh, yeah, I was going to say it took an hour just to go through around 14 controls, and your application manages around 400. So if we could find 40 more hours, then we can go through all 400 just for Windows OS. And then there's also Linux and Mac OS and
Yep.
Cisco switches, and then Fortinet firewalls, Sonic Wall, etc. So everything has a configuration, and then all your SaaS applications all have configurations as well.
Yes.
And if your customer has Salesforce, that the configuration is like 40 different pages. If you keep clicking and keep digging down, it just in rabbit holing into Salesforce settings, for example, you'll spend hours in there of just configuration. So in terms of Windows OS, that's like the core, meaning everyone has either typically a Mac or Windows or Linux that they're working on. So start there first. That's like what everyone uses, right? That's your computing environment. So you want that to be secured first. And then layering on top of that is those computers now need to talk. So then go and configure your network. And then everyone has an identity. So then configure your identity store, whether that's Azure AD or Google Workspace or something else. Then, just it's just layers, but everything has a configuration. And so
Absolutely.
partnering makes sense because nobody can understand every single configuration in every single system. So it's about partnering and leveraging partnerships and leveraging collective knowledge.
Yep, and we're right at time, so I won't go too deep into my thought on that. But I loved how you talked about, the levels that are accessed by that user. So getting onto that OS, that terminal. Maybe the next step, like you said, network. It's got to communicate. One of the next steps is they got to access the internet browser. Hardening all of these steps is creating that incredible foundation. So then you can build on top of it with your EDRs, your SIM, SOAR solutions, whatever that is, right? But it's setting this foundation, and CIS is an incredible resource for that. So thank you guys for the final thoughts. Appreciate everyone joining us today. So we are here every single week. We aim to do this every Wednesday at 1 p.m., pending some changes. We got Dominic Vogel coming up next week to talk about network security. And we do have a newsletter being released every week that provides a deep dive into all the settings we talked about today, and a little resource hub that's being added as well, so you can kind of use these documents and tailor them to your own needs. So very, very much excited to release that. As just kind of a last steps, feel free to connect with us. Me and Dan and Henry, we're all very active on LinkedIn. Dan's definitely trying to get more in the spotlight lately, so excited to support him. And then Senteon, as we have shared today, we do help with the implementation, monitoring, change tracking, everything you have to do with the CIS benchmark. So feel free to sign up for your own free trial, NFRs for MSPs, and we look forward to having you here next week. Thanks, everyone.